And we are live. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Raising Multilinguals Live. My name is Tetsu Young from Ask Tetsu from this. What is it today? It's a cloudy day here, just outside of Montreal. It's not cold enough for my skating rink, but it is winter. It is white outside, unlike where our special guest is from. But I'm going to throw it to Uta first. Hello,
Yes.
Uta.
Hello, my name is Ute Lima-Garibald from Ute's International Lounge, and I say hello from the Netherlands. Here it's evening, so the day was sunny and a little bit cold, but not as cold as on your side of the world, Tetsu.
I don't know. It could be similar. It is like 1 or 2 degrees today, which is, like I said, not cold
Yeah.
enough for my skating rink. We just had like a rainy day just a few days ago. It just sort of ruined my skating rink. But today we're talking languages as usual, because I would love to talk uh, hockey and skating with our special guest today, my very dear friend from how long ago? Too long,
Sure.
too long to want to
Long
mention.
ago, long ago. The years fly by. Absolutely.
Oh my
Yeah.
God. My good friend from Vancouver, Mr. Steve Kaufmann, who's known as a linguist. He calls himself a linguist, but many people call him a polyglot, somebody who speaks many languages, but a language expert. However way you cut it, he has a very good book called The Way of the Linguist. And he's somebody who's started late in life to learn languages, and I thought it would be a great idea to have somebody come on like this who's really learned languages, not like having grown up with languages like myself and Uta, but somebody who's learned it later, and he's gonna tell us about what his experience is learning languages and how that could be applicable through his observations of adults versus kids. And so, without further ado, Steve, welcome. Thank you very
Thank
much
you.
for coming on
Very
our
happy.
little
Very happy
show.
to be here. Nice to see you again, Tets, and to meet Ute.
Thanks.
First of all, I will disagree with you. I didn't learn my first language as a child. In other
Okay.
words, I was born in Sweden
Oh, that's
and
right. Okay.
lived there till I was 5. And then at the age of 5, my family moved to Montreal.
Mm-hmm.
Montreal in those days was, unlike the situation today, was basically two solitudes. There was 1 million English speakers, 2 million French speakers, not an awful lot of interrelationship between the two communities. So I was basically plunked into an English speaking environment.
Yeah.
I have no recollection of transitioning from Swedish to English. My parents said, we're in Canada now, we're going to speak English at home. We spoke English at home. I promptly forgot my Swedish, and I'd be playing with my friends on the street, and it was all in English. And they might have found my Swedish accent strange, but I have no recollection. It's just all of a sudden I was speaking English. I do remember one thing, that we were playing football, and when you fumble a ball, if you recover the ball, like the ball springs loose, right? So both teams try to grab the ball, and it was called recover the ball, and I couldn't understand why it was recovered. Like in my logic, it was supposed to be refumbled. I can still remember that as a kid, I had this reaction. Why is it recovered? I didn't even know what the word recovered meant. But I knew the word fumble because we were playing football. You fumble and then you recovered. Why not refumbled? Anyway, it just points out that as we learn a language, we have an inner logic that tells us that the word should be this way. Particularly in English, like take should be taked. And I'm sure that every child starts because their inner language tells them take should be taked. And at some point, they pick up on the fact that it's not taked, it's took. Not because their mom corrects them, but because they start to hear took more and more frequently. And so then it becomes took. So, yeah, that was my first experience. And also, I guess I was in my late teens, when I got very interested in learning French. Despite the best efforts of my teachers to discourage us from learning French, the teachers we had at school that made French very uninteresting, or maybe I was just not very motivated. But then I had a teacher at McGill University who just made French civilization so attractive to me that I ended up going to France. I spent 3 years there in university in France, and that started me on my sort of language learning journey.
That's the story that I remember you're telling us about.
Yeah, once you want to learn, there's no holding it back. Like, there's only one thing that matters in language teaching, and that is turning on the learner. If you turn on the learner's going to learn. Then I joined the Canadian government, and I was sent to Hong Kong to learn Chinese. So I had no particular interest in Chinese before I was sent there, but that was my job, so I was determined to do it. And as they say in French, l'appétit vient en mangeant. So the more I got into Chinese things, Chinese history, Chinese language, I got more and more sort of motivated, interested in discovering the language, the culture, the history, and so forth.
So that's like language 3 or 4?
3, that would be 3. Well, I'd say I mean, when I say I forgot my Swedish, anything we ever learn is never gone. And I think that memory, I saw this video somewhere, memory consists of our reserve as well as things that we can retrieve. So things that we can retrieve, is my ability to, of the languages, 20 languages that I have tried to learn, some of them I can immediately retrieve them. Let's say a dozen I can get into and speak with, maybe more errors than before, but still I can speak them. And then there's a bunch of others that are in my reserve and I can refresh them, but they're never gone. So any effort we put into learning a language, it's never wasted. It's in there somewhere. And once you go back in there, it comes back very, very quickly.
Is Swedish one of the 20?
Yeah.
As in
Swedish I can get in. Well,
right?
Subsequently, I got keen on Swedish. I did a lot of business in Sweden.
There you go.
Swedish is one of those languages where you have very high quality audiobooks, which is the case with Spanish, not with Spanish, but with Russian, with French, with English, high quality German, high quality audiobooks. So I did a lot of listening Swedish history. There's a guy called Herman Lindqvist who puts out very sort of popularized history of Sweden in Swedish, and he also records them. And so I put a great deal of effort into learning Swedish, and now Swedish is one of my more comfortable languages. I can very easily speak Swedish. And so partly because I had that as a child, but also I put a lot of effort into it. I was there a lot, dealing with people there and so forth. Go ahead. I'll let you ask the questions because I get any number of things that I can say.
No, I was trying to mention. So that's language 3. Then you were already working, right? So you were working.
Language 3 Chinese. My job was to learn Chinese. So 7 hours a day, I would either listen or read or write or learn characters. That was my job. So language 4, go ahead.
When you think, retrospectively, was that fun? I'm sure it would be lots of fun today to do that, but was it fun in those days when it was an obligation to learn Chinese?
Well, that's where your passion for the subject has to take over. I never resisted the language. I remember there was another Canadian diplomat, older guy, and we started at the same time, so we're sitting together. And in Chinese, to say, are you going, as you know, Ted, you say, ni chu bu chu. You go, not go. You go, not go. That's how they ask the question. Are you going? The Chinese go, you go, not go. And this guy's reaction was, is that ever stupid? Okay, so that guy is dead in the water. Like, if your reaction to how people say things in another language is that that's somehow strange or stupid, you're not going to learn the language.
Yeah.
You have to say, oh, isn't that it? That's neat. Wow, they say it that way. And I can actually start saying it that way too. So I can become part of the community of people who say, you're going to go. So it has to become attractive. And of course, the attraction with Chinese, to some extent, it was, okay, ancient China, whatever, the Great Wall. But more than that, it was the period from say the beginning of the 20th century. So you have this ancient civilization, which all of a sudden comes crashing into this Western civilization, and how that, how the two kind of got together. And there was very interesting novels written in the 30s, Lu Xun and others, Lao Tzu and stuff. I just found all of that very fascinating. So you have to at some point, the sort of obligation to learn has to be overtaken by the sort of passion for the subject, not just for the language, but for everything that you can read about the culture in the language.
So to say the obligation needs to be transformed, or you need to transform it into the pleasure.
Exactly.
And click on or switch on the curiosity switch that I always call it like that. If the curiosity switch is on, then you're halfway there.
Curiosity, absolutely. Which initially can be a curiosity about how the language works.
Yeah.
But then eventually curiosity about the culture, the history, etc.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow. Well, let's take a little breather before we go to the meat and potato, I guess, of today's interview. But I do want to do a little shout out to everybody who's watching us right now live on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. So thank you for joining in, and a happy New Year. It doesn't feel so new anymore. We're like 3 weeks into the year, but I still meet my colleagues for the first time in meetings these days. So I'm still saying Happy New Year. So the whole month, I guess, it's Happy New Year. So thank you for joining in, and let's get in to the meat and potatoes now. So we know that you've learned 20 or so languages, mostly as an adult, as we've just heard from you. And you've learned a lot of them, like in the recent years. You've like broken the code, I guess, broken it down. You know how it works, and this sort of goes against the common perception that kids are much better at learning languages, right? But there are differences. I'm sure there are differences that you've observed. What would you say are the key differences between how children and how adults learn? What are the advantages and disadvantages of each? I'm sure that.
Okay. Well, I was thinking about that, So in 1971, my family, my wife and 2 kids, well, no, Carmen was pregnant with our younger son, but we moved to Japan. So we compare my 2 kids and their experience with Japanese and my experience. So I arrived in Japan in 1971. I say, I'm going to learn Japanese. I'm going to learn it within the first 6 months because I want to become functional in Japanese. I don't want to slide into the sort of comfortable speak English, join the expat community kind of thing. So I was motivated to learn Japanese. And so every time I'm in the car, I'm listening, I do all the things, listen and read, listen and read, listen and read. Our kids, we put them into a French yochien, which is like a nursery school run by, there was like a Buddhist temple, I guess, near where we lived. The kids were not motivated. The kids didn't feel as if, first of all, the Japanese are, if you're a foreigner in Japan, you stand out more. You're a bit of more of a sore thumb. You're not just accepted as some other kid. You're like, oh, look at the gaijin. And that can affect kids in different ways. And they were not tremendously motivated. Their only experience of the yochien was when the monk would come by, and if they weren't sitting perfectly straight, he would hit them. Senako-pin. So between that, there was never the same motivation. So they didn't learn. Even though there were Japanese kids in our neighborhood, we lived in an area where there were lots of foreign families. They didn't really learn. I can say they could have if they had been motivated. They played on a hockey team, little kids, where they were amongst the better players, so they had some degree of prestige. They played on a soccer team where the kids kept on pointing at them. And so if you don't feel accepted, you don't want to belong in the milieu, then I don't think kids are better than adults. I was tremendously motivated, and I worked at the embassy. Everybody treated me very well. If I went to a business meeting and I said a few things in Japanese, everybody encouraged me. So I was, wow, I'm doing well. And so I was encouraged. So, and of course, I was able to read stuff. Of interest to me and listen to stuff of interest to me. Vocabulary that was quite advanced in terms of it was adult vocabulary, whereas the kids, they don't have adult vocabulary. They have a limited range of content that they can access if they don't feel comfortable, because kids want to be with their peers. So if either they don't want to be with this group or that group doesn't want them, then that can be a negative experience. If we look at the
exactly
how it started out 4 or 5 between the ages of 4 up to 8.
Okay. Wow, it's
And
very,
I think it's yeah. And if we look at the example in, say, Sweden or the Netherlands, where kids perhaps are not interacting with, say, English speakers, however, they are experiencing a lot of the same cultural, exposure because they're watching television in English, or might be French or Spanish, but all of these things are in the original version. So kids are quite familiar with that culture when they start school. And as a result, kids in the Netherlands or in Scandinavia, they speak English very well. I don't think it necessarily because their teachers are better than elsewhere, but it's because they're exposed to so much of the content. They're already familiar with it. So I think kids can be less inhibited. I spoke to my wife as well. She went to the other thing. She grew up in Macau. She went to a convent school where the kids were from a variety of different backgrounds. But they spoke Chinese amongst each other. So again, it's a bit like French immersion in Canada. The kids speak English to each other, even though they're in French immersion. So I think what's very important is the peer community. Kids, if they're in an environment where they're with kids, they want to be part of that community. They hear the language. They're not the kids have the big advantage that they're not self-conscious. As long as they're accepted, they're not self-conscious. They just communicate. They don't care.
Yes.
Adults, then, oh, gee, I have an accent, or, they're much more self-conscious about their performance. Kids are not at all self-conscious. And I think, too, that prior to the age of 5 or 6 or 8, some point, the kids' brains are more flexible. They haven't yet coalesced around any particular language. They could just as easily have been native speakers of some other language. But where that break is, I don't know. I've heard that anyone who, say, moves to North America past the age of 12 will always have a slight accent, or there's a high probability that they will have a slight accent. Whereas people who come there like I did as a 5-year-old, they will totally, become native speakers. So there's a little background.
all right. But
Yes,
your
but-
kids, did they go into like the normal schools in Japan? Like
No, so they didn't want to. So we put them into St. Mary's. And by the same token, so this is the other thing: kids have to get the buy-in. So when we were in Ottawa for a year,
4 or 5,
we said,
then.
well, when we were in Japan from the ages of 4 to 8.
Yeah.
Then we were in Vancouver. Then we were in Ottawa for a year, and we put them into a French semi-immersion school in Ottawa, and they resented that. They were all they remember from that school is whenever they were in the French class and they spoke English to each other, all the other kids would say, tu parles en anglais, tu parles en anglais. That's all they remember. And they resented the fact that we put them in this school. Why couldn't we just have gone to the local school like everybody else?
Yeah.
One summer, we sent them to a summer camp in Quebec called Camp EdFi, Education Physique. And they resented that.
Wow.
Everything we did to try to get them to speak French. We'd be visiting France, and I'd put on a cassette of French and say, okay, guys, we're going to listen to some French. They resented that. So all I'm saying is, I think what you're doing, Tets, makes a lot of sense. In other words, if you can get the kids early, where there's very little resistance, and expose them to the language, there's no question that exposing kids to languages as early as possible, where there's no resistance, where they just eat it up. They just take it in. It doesn't matter. It's a cartoon, Tom and Jerry. It can be in French. It can be in Chinese. It doesn't matter. That's tremendous. And there's no question that anything that has ever socked into their little brains, it's going to stay with them. They can always go back there and retrieve it. And it makes their brains more flexible. So that if one day, say, someone who is exposed to 3 or 4 languages needs to learn an 8th language, their brain will be more flexible in terms of doing that. So I think that's a very good strategy, what you're doing, Tess.
Yeah,
Yes,
well, thanks.
Absolutely, but I think also I know what Tets is doing, but I think there is also a difference of a child that has been exposed to only one language up to a certain moment and then plunged into another one without being motivated, as you said. So there is this the attitude of the child that is very, very determining the outcome of everything. Like we had Mila Schwartz talking about this topic 2 years ago, I think, already or 3. But what I wanted to say is maybe it doesn't depend on if the child has been exposed to exactly the languages that they will need when they are 8 years old or 4 years old or so, but that they are exposed to multiple languages, to a more international kind of context. Whatever new language you add because you moved there or because they need it for the school or in order to make friends in a new place will be something easier for them to learn. They have another kind of approach. It's I call it a little bit like the multilingual mindset that you have. You are open to the new and you say, okay, bring it on. I'll try to find out how I can juggle this new language and learn it.
I couldn't agree more. And you're open to more sounds.
Yes.
You're open to more different ways of saying things. If somebody says you go not go, that's not strange. That's just how they say it.
Yes.
So that everything becomes your range of things that are normal to you is just much, much larger.
Yes.
If at the age of 60, all of a sudden you have to learn another language, I mean, it's like it threatens your identity. Like, why do these other people speak those other strange languages? Why don't they speak my language?
Yes, but nowadays I would say, where did this person live for 60 years if they haven't been in touch with other languages? I mean, I know there are places, but generally speaking, you know maybe another regional variant of the language that you're speaking. So we are exposed to a broader range of ways to say and to pronounce things. If we go into the detail of each language, we find huge differences there as well. But yes.
Although in North America, it's pretty standard. I mean, at least the syntax is pretty standard. And I think in Japan, it's pretty standard. A little more variety there, but there's lots of unilingual people around in the world. Just want to mention something while I think of it. I was at Longfest in Montreal and addressing 500 people. And I said, how many people, and these are all polyglots, mostly young. And I said, how many people here grew up in a multilingual family? Hardly anyone put their hand up. So the fact that you don't have a multilingual experience as a child doesn't mean that you can't learn if you're motivated. So everything comes back to motivation.
Indeed.
Absolutely.
Indeed. And you see, it's one thing to be a language lover, language aficionado. It's another to really have languages as, for practical, reasons. And that's why I'm so keen on starting early to give my kids the weapons, because I don't know if they're going to love languages. I have no guarantee that they're going to love it, but I do know from my experience that languages help a lot in whatever I do in life. Not just career, but all sorts of relationships, friends. So I just figured I'm going to invest now, let them have it. If they don't want it, they don't use it. There's no harm. But if I can get in and do it as early as possible, even if they don't care about languages at all, they'll have it. That's really the thought process.
Yes, and I would be curious to know, because you said you have two children, and one of your sons, I think, is also born in Japan, or is born when you were in Japan. How was his reaction to Japanese? Because when you are born into that setting, isn't that different maybe to the older sibling?
Well, they're first of all, they're very close together, and they were both essentially, they started speaking in Japan. But I would say that, we lived in a sort of a gaijin compound. I mean, most of the homes in that area were foreigners. But there were also Japanese homes around, apartment blocks, and they all got together and they played baseball or whatever. But whatever, they didn't. I would take the example of my second son. Like, they both have some sense of Japanese, like as they do of French had, by dint of us forcing them to go to, this bilingual school. And so, as to get back to Tetsa's point, even if they resent being pushed into that, it does sit, it still sits there somewhere. But in the case of my younger son, he went back to Japan. He ended up playing professional. So both kids resisted any effort to get them to learn any language, and resented. And maybe my method was a little heavy-handed. I don't know. But then my son ended up playing hockey in Japan he played professional hockey in Europe. So he played in Italy, he played in Austria, in Switzerland, and then in Japan for 3 years. And so then he realized that languages are actually useful because if you're playing on a team, you want to be close to your teammates. And I mean, actually, a professional or any kind of sports team is a great environment for language because you have to be very close with your teammates, right? And so then he now speaks Japanese. He speaks French better, as not because he was on a French team, but because as you learn languages, you get better at learning languages, right? So he has a better understanding of German and Italian, and in fact, he's the one who runs Link. So you know, motivation is just such a big part of it. And I remember when I went out to, he played in Nikko, and I went out to watch him play. And then I went out after one of his games with all of his teammates. And he can speak the sort of very casual Japanese much better than I can.
Wow. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Because I'm very, if we're going to sit down and talk about the price of lumber, I'm better than he is. But the real sort of, and as Tets knows, in Japanese, there are different levels of the language, and there's the kind of grunting language that the young people use with each other. I'm exaggerating, but you know, very kind of casual type of language, and he can do all that stuff, and I can't do it. And so that's by dint of being together with these people, you know, 3 years on the same team. You guys, you know, you're together, and so that gets back to the sense of wanting to belong. And I've often mentioned, if in North America, if you get a Russian hockey player, like he'll be speaking very good English in no time, whereas the professor of physics, Russian at the local university, nobody can understand him, and he's been there for 20 years because he doesn't have that same desire to fit in with his teammates. He probably has his little expat Russian community, and he, you know, reluctantly speaks English to his students, you know. So yeah, a sports team is a great environment.
Indeed.
Yes.
I think, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think this is something that is important to add to what we were asking before. So the childhood might have been less successful, however we want to define success. Maybe we can talk about it in a moment. But seeing now that your older sons are actually juggling these languages, they are using the languages, and they see how useful they are, how important they are to communicate, to connect with a team, with people you work or you live with, shows you also that actually it doesn't matter how much they liked it when they were younger. It is important that they get to like it when they need it, and to improve it once they need it. So that they are there where
and it's mostly the younger one who is into languages. The older boy still not particularly, although when they go to France, he's able to manage somehow.
Yes. Yeah. We never know. I also have 3 children, and they are all 3 different, reacting to all the languages that they are learning. And one is learning one language after the other, or even 2 or 3 at the same time. I don't know how he does it, but so it's nice to see how what we planned then flowers or develops. I find it highly interesting and exciting also to witness. Yeah.
If I may sort of ask something, I don't know. I'm going to do it anyway because we're good friends. It's just going to be okay. What would you have done differently if you were to go back? Because before you answer, I think one thing, like if I take my motivation for my kids to play hockey, right? My oldest, like away from languages, it seems like I wanted more than him, and I try not to, because I don't know, rationally I know I can't push him. I can't, play on his behalf. I can't, force it through. So I don't. So I do leave it to him. But inside, it's just chewing me up when I see other kids like just surpass him. Even though I've given him so much exposure skating, he's like really good at a very young age. But now I see all the other kids pass him. I don't know if languages. We've been pretty successful, so it's pretty good. But I'm wondering, as a parent, in those days, did you want them to speak languages, or was it just like, it's a nice to have? If they speak, it's good. If not, it's.
No, I think a major motivation for us to put them was, and I sort of almost, I thought, wow, like for example, they played hockey in Japan with a local Shinagawa team.
Yep.
And I mean, I don't know how much Japanese they got from being in that environment. They're not going to tell us. They certainly got some because they were with those people and they had their friends. And the coach is speaking to them in Japanese. Undoubtedly, they got a lot. And a big part of my motivation was for them to learn Japanese. That's why we put them in the Yochien school. But as you say, you can't do things for your kids. Watching my kids play hockey, the younger boy, Mark, was much better than the older boy. And so I can't stand there. But I did, though, on the sidelines, getting impatient. Like, why haven't you doing that? You know? You can't. That's so unfair. And you see some hockey parents that just go berserk.
Exactly. I don't want to be that parent.
It's, you know, we live our own life. They live their own life. They have their interests. They'll find, as in the case of my two boys, they found their own areas of interest. But obviously, our motivation, like, and I probably maybe pushed it too hard. You know, because I was so fond of France and French culture, so we drive around France and I'm playing a cassette in the car. That was the wrong thing to do. They still talk about that. They still talk about being sent to the bilingual school and stuff like that.
But and they're not saying, I'm
hand,
so glad that it, you know.
Never. No, not at all. So maybe I pushed it too hard, or I don't know. Certainly, I mean, hockey. They both loved hockey, and even though one was better than the other, you know, the older boy wasn't bad either, and they enjoyed that. And so you have to respect the fact that kids are going to like certain things and not like other things.
Yep.
Yes.
And but that's why I say, and I agree with Tess. Whatever you do, so there could come a point where in the young family there's a revolt at age 10 or 12. I don't want to do this anymore.
Earlier,
it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because everything that's put in. So when they're very young and impressionable and there's very little resistance and they do whatever daddy tells them to, that's a good time to get started. And if later on there's a revolt, nothing is lost. It's all good.
Exactly. I always say we need to, as parents, I mean, we don't want to get into discussing different parenting methods. This is not the place to do this, but it's always good to know when to let go. Yeah, when to let them do their things and continue their way, whether it is learning a language or another language or learning any other skill. That's something that is up to them. So yeah, exactly. So I think one of the next questions that we had is about the experience raising kids abroad. Tetsu, you wanted to ask something more about this? We don't hear you.
Oh, sorry about that. My dog was barking, so I had to take her out outside. Sorry, we were talking about we can't force the kids, right?
Yes.
Well,
yes.
Hang on, sorry, the kid just came back.
Yeah, the raising kids abroad. Yeah, go ahead. I can certainly share my experience in that regard.
Yes.
And that is that in Japan, we would probably have put them in the Japanese school system, but the Japanese school system started in, I don't know, April. I can't remember exactly. And of course, the school system at home started in September. So we were not there permanently. We were there for like three years.
Yes.
So we have to also be conscious of the fact that when they finished, or maybe it was only 2 years more, and then they would come home and go to school in Canada. And if they start the school year in April in Japan, and then we go home and we start the school in September, and parents at that stage are very concerned about not wanting to have their kids lose a year. It seems to be a big deal if they're in with kids that are older or stuff. So I think if it hadn't been for the fact that the Japanese school year starts in April, if I remember correctly, we probably would have put them into Japanese school so that they could get that experience.
Okay, even if only for 3 years or 4?
Even if again, my experience is that if the kids are that young and they have, first of all, they have English at home and they have Japanese at school and whatever they teach in the first 3 years, I'm sure you're not going to lose much. Our thought, in fact, we were tempted to put them into Japanese school, but it was this whole issue of the breaking up the school year, April beginning versus September and so. But I think if you live in a country for any length of time, it's a wonderful opportunity to put the kids into school. And I think the difficulties that my kids experienced, say, on the soccer team there in Japan, is that they didn't know those kids very well. They would just show up twice a week for soccer practice. If you're in a school, you get your friends. You don't have to be friends with everybody in the class, but you're going to find friends.
That's right.
And if you can make friends in a school and you're speaking that language with your friends, almost more than the teachers, I think it's always the peers. I think that it's the peers. And if you get your friends in that language, Japanese, French, whatever it might be, that's so valuable. That's so valuable. So we would certainly have put them into Japanese school if the school year situation hadn't been there.
Yeah,
Totally
but
understand.
I mean, yeah, I also understand it from belonging point of view and somehow, yes, feeling at home in the new place. But on the other hand, I help many families who live internationally and who move every 3, 4, 5 years, depending on where, for who they are working. But one of the things that I usually recommend, and it's also from the Families in Global Transition, which is an organization that supports these families as well, that I'm a member with, we always recommend to think long term. So if we send a child to a certain kind of school with a specific curriculum, to make sure that this curriculum is more or less the same that they will find in the next place and then the next 4, 5 places, because very often these families, the children during their childhood years, have been then in maybe 5, 6, 7 sometimes different places. And if every time you send them to local schools, it's just too much. And that is another criteria, of course.
I agree. And in our case, again, we were there from 71 to 77. So the kids would have been 6 and 7 when they came home. At that age, I don't think it matters much. We went back to Japan when the kids were 10 and 11. And at that point, there was no question of putting them in the Japanese school for the very reason you suggested. They went to an international school, because then, you know, it becomes a little more serious. You know, you've got to be following the curriculum. And especially if you're dealing with families that move around, they'll want to have, you know, a standard curriculum throughout. But I think the first few years of school don't matter so much.
Yes.
I'm not an educator, but that's my impression.
100%. 100%. Whenever we go to, you know, Japan or Taiwan every summer, you know, I always tell the teachers, you know, what's important to us is that the kids, they can integrate into this social circles. Don't worry about the grades. The teachers worry about the grades much more than us. For us, it's like, you know, don't worry about it. We know they're not in Japan, you know, throughout the year. They're going to be behind. So although they've not really been behind, they did catch up really quickly within a few weeks every year. But still not like a top priority for us.
Yes. But what you're doing, Tetsu, maybe for those who don't know it, I just line it a little bit, is you send them every year into the same more or less place. They exactly same school. They find maybe friends from the year before. That is slightly different from those who are then moving to another place. Everything is new. The language is new. The children are new. The curriculum is new. The way of doing maths. I was talking the other day about doing maths. If you learn doing maths in one language and then you learn it in another one, you usually tend to count in your head, do mental math in the first language that you've learned it. And so I've seen children really struggle with during exams because they didn't know which one do I have to do. And seriously, it takes time. It takes really energy, muscle memory and muscle energy to get it right and to answer these questions. So I think, we have to see case per case and see what's...
Well, the thing that I most agree with Steve about is like the first few years. Like I would say primary school. Doesn't matter. Like for me, from high school, that's when you start to push more and more, and especially the latter half, you know, of secondary school before going to university. Those are like the critical years. So I wouldn't want to burn the kids out during primary school and get like super high marks in those years. But I also agree that, you know, if I were moving from country to country, or different country every year, I would want a continuity there. If it's one language or maximum 2. But what we do is we go to the same school every year, same friends. So that inclusion aspect, that
Is given.
acceptance aspect, the social aspect that Steve kept talking about, is really important for us. So that's how we support them.
The other thing too is that in French immersion in Canada, they found that they have early immersion where you start in French. These are English-speaking kids going to school in French. So early immersion, you start grade 1 in French, and late immersion is grade 8. And so all of a sudden, everything is in French. They found that the late immersion kids catch up very, very quickly. So that it's not like if you don't start at grade 1, then you're forever at a disadvantage.
No.
It doesn't seem to be the case. They catch up.
No.
Kids, they catch up very quickly. What I think is almost a bigger issue is the social. There are some kids that are not going to react very well to having, being plunked into a strange environment all the time. And I can remember even in grade 8, we had a kid come over from Britain. And I remember feeling sorry for him. Like, wow, he's been transplanted from Britain, doesn't know anyone. Kids like, the same people all the time. It's difficult to just, unless that's why it's good that you're going to the same school tests with your kids. Otherwise, kids can start to withdraw. And so I think one has to be always conscious. Not all kids react the same way. Not all kids are going to learn languages equally well either, and not all kids have the same social skills, and some are more introverted, and so there's all kinds of stuff there that has to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, very important that the parents really take that into account.
Yes, they're very, very attentive, and also that the teachers are aware of where the child is coming from and what the skills of the child are in the school language and the other languages, and I don't know what other subjects. I would like to share one comment from Yen Ankat. How did your kids have time for the school works, extra activities, and learning new languages? So I suppose when you were in Japan.
Well, we're in Japan, so the first couple of years, again, I don't know what they learned in school, but it wouldn't have been very much. They started out in the Japanese nursery school and then went to, St. Mary's, which is an international school. But then when we were there for 2 years, the second time, they were at an international school. So they just did whatever the normal activities were there with their friends. And their friends would have been a mixture of, I think, maybe some Japanese families that had moved back from abroad, international families. A lot of kids were mixed Japanese and non-Japanese, parents, and that was a community, and they fitted in very nicely. They played sports, they studied, they did all their, they weren't learning languages on their own.
No,
I think that's the key.
They were,
exactly. They're just living life as usual.
They're just doing what kids do.
Language is the consequence of being in that context.
What about the next question? We have another nice question to ask you. As you also give in your YouTube channels, etc., you tell about which language you are learning and what languages maybe to learn next. And how can we choose actually which next languages to learn? I mean, there are some languages that are very similar, others are very different from those we know, different scriptures, different alphabets, intonations.
Ultimately, it becomes a matter of motivation. So having learned, so for me, for example, French, and then I decided Spanish is so close. I was keen to learn Spanish. I did a lot of hitchhiking in Spain. I learned Spanish. I learned Mandarin. Then I went to Japan. I learned Japanese, and I was very keen to learn these languages, and learn about the cultures and listening to it and everything else. Then at some point I said, geez, I know Japanese and Chinese. I should learn Korean. But that petered out, and I got turned on to Russian instead. So you never know, what the reason was. I think I was learning Korean, and my approach to language learning is to sort of de-emphasize grammar, not to ignore it, but to say, first get the language in you and get used to the patterns of the language, and then you can always look up these grammar rules later on, and by that time they'll make more sense to you. And someone said, well, that might work for Asian languages, but it'll never work for Russian. So I said, okay, we'll give that a try. So then I abandoned Korean and I went off and did Russian. I'm back to Korean right now, by the way, along with my Persian and Arabic. But I think it's just a matter of motivation. Unless if you're learning as a dilettante, which is my situation, right?
Mhm.
If you have to learn English for work, or you have to learn Spanish, or if you're Polish and you got to learn German, so then there's no choice. You've got to learn that language, right? But if you're just doing it for fun, to me, Arabic, Persian, Arabic. I started with Arabic, and then there's so many Iranians in Vancouver. I decided I'd learn Persian, and then once you get into that, you realize how much history there is in Central Asia and stuff, and then
Absolutely.
wow, and then Turkish, and you're reading books even in English about Buhara. So it just whatever turns your crank. If you're doing it for fun, then it should be fun.
Yeah, exactly.
That's there's no obvious, but obviously, I mean, you speak Spanish well. Why don't I learn Portuguese and I can put another one? Claim credit for one more language. And Romanian, we do business in Romania, so I learned Romanian before going over there. And obviously, the fact that I know other Romance languages makes it a lot easier to learn Romanian. So you can always take advantage of the languages that you know, but ultimately you have to be motivated to learn that language.
Yes.
Ukrainian from Russian, because I was starting to follow the events of 2014 on Ukrainian television, where half the people speak Russian and half the people speak Ukrainian. That's the situation in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And so I couldn't understand the Ukrainian speakers. The Russian speakers were also Ukrainian, but I could understand them. I couldn't understand the Ukrainian speakers. So now I'm motivated to learn Ukrainian. So it could be anything that comes along to motivate you.
Yes, absolutely. Exactly. And when talking about languages or language, you just mentioned that you were learning Arabic and Persian simultaneously, if I understand, and maybe also Korean. So about learning two languages simultaneously, let's say that they are very similar and both are new. So let's say you never learned any Romance language and you want to learn French and Italian at the same time. I mean, I tried to learn some languages simultaneously that are imparented linguistically, and I failed. I got confused, not confused, but I got a little bit tired of confusing all the time the different sentences, the structures, and also the vocabulary. What would you say?
Well, I would say that based on my experience now, Arabic and Persian are not related, although there's a lot of shared vocabulary.
No, they are not.
I am enjoying my discovery of Persian and Arabic and a little bit of Turkish. If I had spent all my time on one language, I would be further ahead, but then I wouldn't have experienced the other two.
Yes.
So it depends what your goal is. If you're in a hurry to improve, you should focus on one. There is also the fact that we all know from language learning, you reach the plateau where you've learned the high frequency words. You've gone from 0 to a certain level. You can say a few things, you can understand a few things, and now it looks like you're not making any progress. Yeah. And it sometimes can be quite refreshing to leave that language, go back to another language, do some stuff there for a while.
Yes.
That's all now new now. Then when you come back to the other language, it's new again. The brain likes change. The brain likes novelty. The brain needs repetition. But the brain, as I always quote Manfred Spitzer, this German neuroscientist, the brain likes repetition, but the brain likes novelty.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
You got to choose. But if you focus on one, you'll do better. Yeah, in that language.
But what you just said, the brain needs repetition and novelty from Spitzer. Is in fact, then it's easier, especially if you already know a few languages and you start with one and you do it for fun. Let's say that you don't have someone who tells you in 6 months you need to be able to do this and that. Then you can switch from one language to the other. When you get tired or you reach this plateau that you just mentioned in one language, you switch to the other one, and that way you gain again some motivation from language B to continue with language A, and so you
exactly.
You attain certain levels that maybe you wouldn't have achieved if you were focusing only on one, right?
I mean, I think if we
I don't know.
Yes, if we enjoy the process, if the process is the reward, okay, the process is more important than any goal. So if we enjoy what we're doing, why do I care? I conceivably could be learning Arabic faster, but I don't have to perform. I have no test to write. I'm enjoying my Arabic when I do Arabic. I enjoy my Persian when I do my Persian. I'm enjoying my Korean now that I'm doing Korean. And I genuinely do enjoy the time that I spend with those languages while I'm doing it. So that's good enough. But I know from experience that if I am enjoying what I'm doing, then I'll spend more and more time on it. And if I spend more and more time on it, I will improve. However slowly, I am continuing to improve. So good enough.
Yes.
Well, let's bring back something you said earlier. Yoshito is trying to quote you.
Okay.
If you're doing it for fun, then it should be fun. Wow.
Exactly.
Can't be truer than that. We'll have to quote Steve Kaufmann on this going forward. It is true. It's just a lot of people they want that end product more than the process, and that can blind us from the process, like you say, and it keeps us afar from the end result if we don't enjoy it.
Yeah, and it can be demotivating in the long run. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
All right. So all this language adventure throughout your life sort of came together into a product called Link.
Right.
Been very fortunate to sort of see Link from quite the early days and see it become the fantastic app that everybody talks about now in the global language community. So how about you tell us a little bit about Link, how it came about, and of a special interest for us, I guess, is whether kids use that. Do they use it differently, or what's your observation?
Okay. First of all, about Link.
Yep.
So a couple of thoughts. First of all, MP3 technology, in other words, the portability of audio. All right. Picture me 50 some years ago learning Chinese, big open reel tape recorder, parked on my desk, doesn't move anywhere, and that's where I listen, right? Evolved through the cassette player that would very quickly go and all that little, tape that all get tangled, right? Then we came to the mini disc player and finally MP3. That is revolutionary in terms of language learning. So you can carry on your little iPhone language labs that would have been the envy of any university language lab 30 years ago. And the other thing is, the internet, of course, as a source of content, as a source of information, conjugate this Portuguese verb or decline this Russian noun, you just look it up and there it is. Online dictionaries, you can immediately look things up, which is a big difference because if you look something up in a dictionary, you immediately forget what was in the dictionary. Whereas if you can look it up online and save it somewhere and refer back to it, and there's a whole bunch of stuff. So this sort of dawned on me, and I had these Spanish books and German books and full of underlined words that I didn't understand that I never ever learned. Even though I underlined them and looked them up and made lists, I never ever learned them. And so all of this came together around the idea of Link. We can take advantage of this technology. And now we not only access, newspaper articles, we access YouTube videos, Netflix, podcasts, and there's so much stuff out there. And Link simply is a platform. There's some functionality about helping you learn words and phrases, tracking your activity. And I always say the most important thing in language learning is your level of activity. Don't try to track how well people are doing. There's going to be some difference between people for various reasons and pronunciation or vocabulary or whatever. Make sure they stay active. Yeah, keep them active. Let them know how they're doing. Track their activity. They can tell even when they feel they're not progressing. In fact, they have been reading so many words. They've been listening to so many hours. They've been saving so many words. So all of that is built into Link. To what extent can Link be used for kids? Okay, there are several considerations. One is a big part of it is reading and listening. So how would the kid listen? Is the kid going to walk around like I do with AirPods in his ear or her ear and listen to stories? I don't think so. I don't know. So with kids, it's going to be more like videos maybe, or listen to a story. Like, I think it's a pity that everything is video. I know my experience, for example, with Chinese. If I watch a movie of the, Sanguo Yanyi, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, versus listening to a traditional storyteller tell it, I mean, I can smell the dust of the horse's hooves when I listen to the storyteller, and when I watch the video, a bunch of guys charging around and sword fighting, it's not even close. Like the imagination, the stimulus to your imagination from listening is much greater than from watching something. But I don't know if kids will just listen to stories. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. The other thing is content. Of course, you have to have kid-oriented content. And so you go back to, I mean, in a way, if you look at the success of kids in Sweden and maybe Singapore, I don't know what goes on in Singapore, but I know that they're very multilingual there. If kids get access to things of interest to them in their language, they're going to learn. Will they do the link thing where they're looking up words? And I mean, we have things that are a little more gamified now. I would be happy to talk to an expert in the subject. How do you make a version of link for kids? So, but we're not there yet. We're not there yet.
I mean, when you think about it, I mean, theoretically, you don't need a separate version. It's just the content that the kids would pull into Link would be for kids. Just
right.
like,
and they have to be willing. Yeah. But then they have to be willing to read it and look up words. And then we play little games with the words. And I
guess a few tweaks in the functionalities, but the overall platform itself, that's the beauty of Link, is you bring in what you like, what you want to read. Rather than the app telling you this is the vocabulary, do this drill, whatever. And that's why I think it's so popular and people are raving about it. It's that flexibility of taking in what you want, what you want to read, what you want to see.
And maybe I would like to come back to what you just said, whether children would be prone also to only listen to audio material. They might be more attracted to videos, but that I think depends, first of all, the age of the child, and then also of the comprehension of what they are listening to. So if the input is comprehensible, then they might be able to, associate then that with the smell and everything that you just mentioned yourself. But if they don't know yet how to connect what they are listening to images and to the reality that is portrayed in the story, then video might be helpful for the first approach, because if they are not immersed into the language, of course, then the videos are a great tool for them to at least dive into this kind of world of culture through the videos. And then at some point, maybe when they're older, I see it with my children as well, when they were older, or when they had attained a certain level of comprehension, they would also like to listen to stories more than watching videos, because they could make their own videos in their imagination.
I think audio is sometimes neglected. I mean, for most of history, it was primarily audio, storytellers. In every culture, you had storytellers that went from town to town telling stories. And even now, like I find an audiobook, we were talking about language learning, the goal versus the process. And so I just happened to pick up this book called Atomic Habits, which deals with that. It's quite interesting, actually, and how you develop habits, that the focus shouldn't be on the goal, but on the various activities and the process that you do on a regular basis. But to try to read that book, like so many of these self-help books, it's just too boring. Whereas if you sit in the car and you're stuck, I have to go like for an hour. So I'm listening, and audio is, it's not just for, say, historical romance or at least novels, but listening is powerful. Listening is powerful. And I think kids will listen, but as you say, they have to be able to understand it. And that's where, again, with Link, if they can access the transcript. So then let's say if the kids were to go through the same process as I do, which is I listen, I don't understand, or I understand 20% or sometimes 0, but then I can read and I can look up words, and now I understand a little bit more. And then I listen again. Now, will the kid listen again? Because I find that when I begin in a language, I will listen many, many times, because I'm intrinsically motivated to try to learn how the language works, whereas the child is just more interested in the story. So, I guess it depends on the stage and how much they already know. So it could be one of the tools. More audio.
Yeah.
Definitely. Well, it is suddenly the top of the hour already.
Okay.
It's always a pleasure speaking with you, Steve. You learn so much every time. And it's a coincidence, maybe, but exactly 1 year ago, our first session of 2022, was
Wow.
Switch.
our friend, your very dear friend, Stephen Krashen, who
Oh,
came on
yes.
to talk to us. So,
Yeah.
it's always very enlightening. So, thank you very much for sharing your time. I know you're very
Well,
busy
I think-
traveling around.
I'm not so busy, but I do. I really, I heartily support what you're doing.
Thank you so much.
Language is a big
Okay.
part of my life, and the earlier kids start, the better. But even if they don't start early, people can learn at any age,
That's right.
however old they are.
That is something we want to let our audience know. Also, it's never too late. It is better earlier for certain things, but sometimes it is better to start later, depending on your priorities, depending on where you want to put your resources. But that's another whole big can of worms.
Hey.
We wouldn't want to open that right away. But definitely, we encourage all the parents to try to give the gift of language to their children. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very
All
much.
right.
Best
Thank
wishes
you.
for
Thank you.
2023.
Okay.
And we'll
Thank you.
see you
Best wishes.
very soon.
Okay.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Tot de volgende keer.
Sayonara.